The ingredients are thoroughly incorporated together. Mix them well.
Imagine trying to feed your family with just a few cents a day. No supermarkets overflowing with food, no fast food, and no guarantee of when the next meal would come. This was the reality for millions of people during the Great Depression. Jobs disappeared, money was scarce, and families had to get creative to survive. But tough times also brought out incredible resourcefulness. People learned how to stretch ingredients, find substitutes for expensive items, and make every last scrap of food count. Nothing went to waste because wasting food meant wasting money, something nobody could afford. And while the Great Depression may be history, the lessons from that era still hold value today. Whether you're looking to cut down on grocery bills, reduce food waste, or just appreciate the resilience of past generations, these old-school cooking tricks are worth knowing. Some of them might even come in handy for you today. 1. Stretching meat with fillers. Meat was a luxury during the Great Depression, and families had to make every bit count. A single pound had to stretch across multiple meals, so simply serving it as is wasn't an option. Instead, people found clever ways to bulk it up using cheap, filling ingredients. What started as a necessity quickly became a habit. One of the most common tricks was breadcrumbs. Stale bread wasn't thrown out. It was dried, crushed, and mixed into ground beef to make meatloaf, burgers, and meatballs. But bread wasn't the only solution. Oats were another go-to, soaking up moisture and blending seamlessly into the meat without altering the flavor too much. Some families even mashed beans or grated potatoes into their mixtures, adding both bulk and nutrients. It wasn't just about making meat last, it was about making sure every meal was as filling as possible. And just like that, a tiny portion of protein could feed an entire family. This method didn't just get people through tough times, it stuck around. Even today, some of the most popular comfort foods owe their existence to the Depression-era ingenuity. 2. Turning scraps into broth. During the Great Depression, nothing was truly waste. Not even the parts of food most people toss without a second thought. Vegetable peels, meat bones, and even wilted greens had a second life in the kitchen. Instead of throwing them away, families turned these scraps into rich, flavorful broths that formed the base of countless meals. When every ingredient mattered, even the smallest bits were put to good use. Bones in particular were too valuable to waste. A single chicken carcass or beef bone could be simmered for hours, extracting every bit of flavor and nutrients. To stretch it even further, families often reused the same bones multiple times, boiling them again and again until they gave up every last drop of goodness. If there wasn't any meat available, vegetable scraps like onion skins, carrot tops, and celery leaves were used to create a hearty, meat-free broth. What started as a necessity became a tradition. Homemade broth wasn't just a way to survive. It made soups richer, stews heartier, and plain meals feel just a little more comforting. And really, why waste what can still give so much? 3. Using every part of a vegetable. When food was scarce, people couldn't afford to be picky. Every part of a vegetable, stems, leaves, skins, had a purpose, and nothing was casually thrown away. What many might see as scraps today were essential ingredients back then, helping families stretch their meals without spending an extra dime. Take carrot tops, for example. Instead of tossing them, people chopped them up for soups, stews, or even salads. Beet greens and radish leaves weren't considered trash. They were cooked like spinach and packed with nutrients. Even potato peels had value, often fried or baked into crispy snacks. If something was edible, it was eaten. But it wasn't just about getting more food, it was about making meals better. Corn cobs, after the kernels were removed, could be simmered to make a subtly sweet broth. Onion and garlic skins added depth to soups before being strained out. It was a simple mindset. If a vegetable had anything left to give, it was put to work. Today, with the exorbitant food costs, maybe this waste-nothing approach is worth bringing back. 4. Diluting milk to make it last. Milk was a staple, but during the Great Depression, it wasn't always easy to come by. With money tight and rationing in place, families had to get creative to make their supply stretch. Instead of using it full strength, they found ways to dilute it without completely sacrificing taste or nutrition. It wasn't ideal, but it was better than running out. One of the simplest tricks was adding water. By mixing equal parts milk and water, families could instantly double their supply. Sure, it wasn't as creamy, but for recipes like soups, sauces, or even drinking, it still did the job. Some even thickened the watered-down milk with a bit of flour or cornstarch to bring back some of the lost texture. When things got really tough, people turned to alternatives. Powdered milk, though not as common back then, became a go-to when fresh milk wasn't available. Others used evaporated milk mixed with water, or even made milk from ground oats or rice. 5. Saving grease and drippings. When money was tight, cooking oil and butter became luxuries that many families couldn't afford to use freely. But instead of going without, they found a simple solution: saving every bit of grease and drippings from cooking. What most people today would toss in the trash was once a kitchen essential, adding both flavor and fat to meals when nothing else was available. Bacon grease was one of the most valuable byproducts of cooking. After frying bacon, people would carefully pour the leftover fat into a jar and store it for later. It was used to fry potatoes, saute vegetables, or even spread on bread like butter. Lard from pork, beef tallow, and even chicken fat, often called schmaltz, were also collected and reused, ensuring no source of fat went to waste. Fat added calories and richness to otherwise bland meals, helping families feel full even when portions were small. And funny enough, many chefs today vouch for bacon grease for its depth of flavor. Probably the best meals were had during the Depression era. 6. Extending butter with other ingredients. Butter was a rare treat for many families during the Great Depression. With dairy prices high and rationing in place, using it sparingly wasn't just a choice, it was a necessity. Instead of slathering it on bread or using it generously in recipes, people found clever ways to stretch their supply by mixing it with other ingredients. One of the most common tricks was blending butter with milk or water to make it go further. By whipping softened butter with a small amount of liquid, families could create a spread that looked and felt like butter, but lasted much longer. Some even added a pinch of flour or cornstarch to help stabilize the mixture and maintain the texture. For those who couldn't afford butter at all, alternatives like lard or margarine became common. Some mixed butter with mashed potatoes or cooked flour paste to make an even creamier spread. It wasn't the real thing, but when times were tough, having something, anything, to spread on a slice of bread made all the difference. Even today, these old-school tricks can be useful for stretching a grocery budget without sacrificing too much flavor. 7. Using egg substitutes. Eggs were a kitchen staple, but during the Great Depression, they weren't always easy to come by. When money was tight or stores ran out, families had to get creative with replacements. Instead of giving up on their favorite recipes, they found surprising ways to mimic the binding and moisture that eggs provide. One of the most common tricks was using vinegar and baking soda. This simple combination created a reaction that added lift to baked goods like cakes and biscuits. Another popular option was mashed bananas, which worked well in pancakes and muffins while adding a hint of natural sweetness. If bananas weren't available, people used applesauce or even mashed pumpkin to achieve a similar effect. For recipes that needed structure, some turned to flax seeds or gelatin mixed with water. Others used leftover bean liquid, what we now call aquafaba, to replace egg whites in recipes like meringue soups. 8. Using cheaper fats instead of butter. When butter was too expensive or simply unavailable, families didn't let that stop them from cooking and baking. They found creative alternatives using whatever fats they could get their hands on. It wasn't about preference, it was about survival. And if it worked, it was good enough. One of the most common substitutes was lard, which came from rendered pork fat. It was cheaper than butter, lasted a long time, and worked just as well for frying, baking, and even spreading on bread. Some even said that pie crusts made with lard were flakier than those made with butter. If pork fat wasn't available, beef tallow was another option, often used for deep frying or making savory pastries. For those who didn't eat meat or couldn't afford lard, homemade margarine became a solution. Some people even used vegetable oil or shortening in place of butter, adjusting their recipes to make up for the difference in texture and flavor. It wasn't about getting the perfect taste, it was about making sure food got on the table, no matter what. 9. Homemade coffee alternatives. When real coffee was too expensive or unavailable, people didn't just go without, they got creative. A morning cup of something warm and bitterer was a daily ritual, and families found ways to replicate the taste of coffee using whatever they had on hand. It wasn't the real thing, but when times were tough, close enough was good enough. One of the most common substitutes was roasted chicory root. It had a deep, earthy flavor similar to coffee and became a popular stand-in. Some families roasted barley or wheat, grinding it into a powder to brew a dark, nutty drink. Dandelion roots were another go-to, dried and roasted to create a surprisingly rich and slightly bitter beverage. For those who wanted something a little smoother, a mix of cocoa shells and hot water created a mild, chocolatey drink. While these alternatives didn't provide caffeine, they offered comfort and routine. And surprisingly, chicory coffee is still popular today. 10 sugar substitutes. When sugar was too expensive or simply unavailable, people had to rethink how they sweetened their food. Instead of going without, they turned to natural alternatives that were cheaper, more accessible, and sometimes even healthier. If it added a touch of sweetness, it was fair game. One of the most common replacements was honey. It was easier to find, lasted a long time, and worked in everything from baking to tea. If honey wasn't an option, people used molasses, which not only sweetened food, but also added a rich, deep flavor. For an even more creative approach, some used mashed fruits, like bananas, apples, or even prunes, to naturally sweeten cakes, biscuits, and breads. Even beet juice and carrot syrup were used to replace refined sugar. Considering how expensive sugar is now, maybe it's time to revisit some of these old-school tricks. 11. Stretching flour. Flour was a pantry staple, but during the Great Depression, even the most basic ingredients had to be stretched to last. With money tight and food supplies unpredictable, people got creative by mixing flour with other, more affordable ingredients to extend its use. This not only made their flour supply go further, but also introduced new flavors and textures into their meals. One of the most common tricks was blending flour with cornmeal. Cornmeal was cheaper and widely available, making it a perfect way to bulk up bread, biscuits, and pancakes. Another alternative was mashed potatoes, which helped create soft, fluffy bread while cutting down on the amount of flour needed. Some families even mixed in ground oats or rice flour, both of which added extra nutrition without affecting the texture too much. But it wasn't just about stretching supplies, it was about making do with what you had. Even in baking, people learned to adjust, swapping wheat flour for whatever grains were available. Today, with the rising cost of food, these Depression-era tricks still hold up and can save up some money other important things. 12. Flourless meals. When flour was too scarce to use freely, families didn't just cut back on baking, they found completely new ways to cook. Instead of relying on traditional breads and pastries, they turned to flourless recipes that use simple, everyday ingredients to keep meals filling and satisfying. One of the most popular alternatives was potato pancakes. By grating potatoes and mixing them with eggs, or an egg substitute, and a bit of salt, people could make a crispy, hearty meal without needing a single scoop of flour. Dumplings were another go-to, often made with mashed potatoes, or even just cornstarch and water, proving that you didn't need wheat to create something delicious. For baked goods, families got creative by using cornmeal, oats, or even beans as a base. Some even made biscuits using nothing but lard, milk, and a little baking powder, skipping flour entirely. These adjustments redefined how people cooked. Interestingly, many of these flourless meals are still enjoyed today, whether for dietary reasons or just because they taste that good. 13. One-pot meals. When resources were limited, cooking multiple dishes for a meal simply wasn't practical. Instead, families relied on one-pot meals, simple, filling dishes that combined whatever ingredients were available into a single pot. This approach wasn't just about convenience. It was about making sure nothing went to waste, while also saving on cooking fuel. One of the most common one-pot meals was vegetable stew, where families threw in leftover vegetables, bits of meat, if they had any, and a handful of grains like rice or barley. Another favorite was hobo stew, a mix of canned goods, potatoes, and scraps of meat, often cooked over an open fire. If meat was out of the question, families relied on beans and lentils, simmering them with onions, garlic, and whatever spices they had on hand to create a hearty, protein-packed dish. These meals were versatile. Ingredients changed based on what was available, and nothing ever tasted exactly the same twice. But that was part of the charm. Even today, one-pot meals remains a go-to for busy families and budget-conscious cooks. 14. Baking without an oven. An oven was a luxury for many families during the Great Depression, especially for those living in small apartments, on farms without proper stoves, or even in makeshift camps. But that didn't mean people stopped baking, it just meant they had to get creative with how they did it. One of the most popular methods was stovetop baking, where biscuits, cornbread, and even cakes were cooked in a covered pan over low heat. Cast iron skillets became essential, allowing people to make everything from flatbreads to skillet cakes without needing an oven. Another trick was using a Dutch oven, a heavy pot with a tight lid that could be placed over an open flame, or even buried in hot coals to mimic an oven's heat. For those without access to even a stovetop, makeshift ovens were built out of bricks, metal scraps, or whatever materials were available. Families found ways to bake bread over campfires, using hot stones to generate heat. It was all about adapting, and when fresh bread or warm biscuits were on the line, people found a way. Today, these old-school baking methods are used by campers, off-grid homesteaders, and anyone looking to cook with minimal resources. 15. Sun-drying food. When refrigeration was not an option, families had to find other ways to preserve food, and one of the simplest yet most effective methods was sun-drying. This technique wasn't new. It had been used for centuries, but during the Great Depression, it became a survival skill that helped people store food without the need for expensive equipment. Fruits like apples, peaches, and berries were sliced thin and laid out in the sun to dry, turning into chewy, long-lasting snacks that could be rehydrated for cooking later. Vegetables, including tomatoes, peppers, and green beans, were also dried and stored for soups and stews during winter. Even herbs were hung in bunches to dry, ensuring families had seasoning long after fresh supplies ran out. Meat preservation also relied on sun-drying, with families making jerky by salting thin strips of beef or venison and leaving them out to dry in the open air. This method removed moisture, preventing spoilage and making food last for months. Today, sun-drying is still a trusted preservation method. 16. Fermenting for preservation. When food supplies were uncertain, families couldn't afford to let anything go to waste. That's where fermenting came in, a process that not only preserved food, but also enhanced its flavor and nutritional value. Whether through pickling, culturing, or natural fermentation, people found ways to make their fresh ingredients last much longer. One of the most common fermented foods was sauerkraut, made by salting shredded cabbage and letting it ferment in jars. This simple process created a tangy, probiotic-rich food that could be eaten months later. Pickled cucumbers, carrots, and beets were also common, stored in vinegar or brine to extend their shelf life. Some families even pickled watermelon rinds, proving that nothing had to be thrown away. Beyond vegetables, homemade yogurt and buttermilk were also created through fermentation, providing essential nutrients when fresh dairy was scarce. The best part? Fermented foods often improved in flavor over time, turning simple ingredients into something rich and complex. Even with modern refrigeration, many people still rely on fermented foods for both preservation and health benefits. 17. Canning everything. When fresh food was scarce or unpredictable, canning became a lifeline. Families preserved everything from fruits and vegetables to meats and soups, ensuring they had food stored away for the leaner months. This wasn't just a survival tactic, it was a way of life that kept households fed when grocery stores weren't an option. Fruits like peaches, apples, and berries were canned in sugar syrup or their own juices, ready to be used in pies, preserves, or eaten straight from the jar. Vegetables, such as green beans, corn, and tomatoes, were packed in water or brine to extend their shelf life. Even meats, including chicken, beef, and fish, were pressure canned, allowing families to have protein available without refrigeration. Canning required patience and skill, but it was worth it. It meant that even during the harshest winters, there was always something to eat. Today, canning has made a comeback, with many people employing it not just for its practicality, but also for the satisfaction of knowing exactly what's in their food. 18. Reusing cooking water. During the Great Depression, nothing was wasted, not even water. When vegetables, pasta, or meat were boiled, the leftover water wasn't poured down the drain. Instead, it was saved and repurposed to add flavor and nutrients to other meals. This simple habit stretched resources further and made meals heartier without spending an extra dime. For example, the water used to boil potatoes or pasta was rich in starch, making it perfect for thickening soups or gravies. The same went for vegetable water, which contained leftover vitamins and minerals. Instead of using plain water for stews, people added this nutrient-packed liquid to make the dish more filling and flavorful. Even bone broth, made by simmering leftover bones and scraps, became a staple, providing a rich, savory base for countless meals. This practice wasn't just about saving money, it made food taste better and ensured that nothing nutritious was lost. Even today, chefs and home cooks alike make the best meals by using saved cooking water. 19. In tough times, food wasn't wasted, no matter how unappetizing it looked. Stale bread wasn't seen as useless. It was an opportunity to create something new. Instead of throwing it out, families found creative ways to turn dry, hardened loaves into filling, tasty meals. One of the most popular tricks was making bread pudding. By soaking stale bread in a mixture of milk, eggs, or egg substitutes, and sugar, families transformed dry scraps into a warm, comforting dessert. Another simple solution was French toast, where slices were dipped in milk and fried to make a soft, satisfying breakfast. But stale bread wasn't just for sweets. It was also used as a meat extender, crumbled into ground beef to bulk up meatballs or meatloaf. Croutons and breadcrumbs were other easy fixes, adding crunch to salads or acting as a coating for fried foods. With a little imagination, no loaf ever went to waste. A lot of people today still use these tricks, not just out of necessity, but because, surprisingly, they make meals even better. 20. Eating wild plants. When grocery stores were out of reach and money was tight, people turned to nature for food. Foraging became an essential skill, with families gathering wild plants to supplement their meals. What many saw as weeds, others recognized as free, nutritious food. Dandelion greens were one of the most commonly eaten wild plants, sautéed or added to salads for a bitter, spinach-like flavor. Wild onions and garlic were also easy to find and added much-needed taste to soups and stews. Some even harvested purslane, nettles, and lamb's quarters, all of which provided essential vitamins. Foraging wasn't just about plants. Families also collected nuts and berries, preserving them for later use. Hickory nuts, blackberries, and elderberries were turned into jams, teas, or just eaten fresh. The key was knowing what was safe to eat and how to prepare it. Today, foraging is making a comeback, not just for survival, but as a way to eat fresh, natural foods. It turns out that Depression-era wisdom wasn't just practical, it also encouraged people to see food in places they would never thought to look. 21. Making potato peel snacks. When food was scarce, people couldn't afford to throw anything away, not even potato peels. Instead of discarding them, families found ways to turn these scraps into tasty, crunchy snacks. What started as a necessity became a clever way to enjoy something crispy and satisfying without spending an extra dime. One of the simplest methods was frying the peels in leftover bacon grease or lard, creating a crunchy, salty snack similar to potato chips. Some families baked them in the oven, seasoning them with salt and pepper for a healthier, crispy treat. Others used them in soups and stews, where the peels thickened broths and added an earthy flavor. These weren't just about making do, they were genuinely delicious. Today, many restaurants and home cooks have rediscovered this old trick, serving crispy potato peels as a gourmet snack. What was once seen as waste has now become a trendy, sustainable way to enjoy every part of the potato. 22. Stretching soups with grains. When there wasn't enough to go around, stretching meals was essential. One of the best ways to do that was by adding grains like rice, barley, or oats to soups and stews. Not only did this make the meal more filling, but it also helped absorb the flavors, creating something hearty and satisfying. Rice was a popular choice, turning a thin broth into a more substantial dish. Barley added texture and nutrition, making even a simple vegetable soup feel rich and satisfying. Some families even added oats, which may sound unusual, but worked surprisingly well in thickening stews. The beauty of this trick was that it allowed families to make small amounts of meat or vegetables last longer. A handful of rice or barley could turn a simple pot of broth into a meal that fed an entire family. Many people in the world still use this technique, not just for budgeting, but because it creates warm, comforting meals that go a long way in communicating love and care. 23. Using cheese rinds for flavor. When money was tight, people made sure to use every bit of what they had, right down to the cheese rinds. Instead of tossing out the tough, hardened ends of cheese blocks, families found a clever way to squeeze every last bit of flavor from them. A common trick was simmering cheese rinds in soups, stews, and sauces, allowing them to slowly melt and infuse the dish with a rich, savory depth. This worked especially well with Parmesan rinds, which added a deep umami flavor to broths and pasta sauces. Some even tossed them into bean dishes to enhance the creaminess. Once the cooking was done, the softened rind could be removed or eaten if it had softened enough. This wasn't just a Depression-era necessity. It's a trick still used by chefs today. Adding a cheese rind to a simmering pot is a simple way to elevate a dish without spending extra money. 24. Saving fruit peels. When food was precious, nothing was wasted, not even the peels. Families discovered that fruit peels, especially from citrus fruits, had a variety of uses beyond the compost bin. One of the most popular tricks was making candied citrus peels. Orange or lemon peels were boiled, then coated in sugar, creating a sweet, chewy treat that could last for weeks. Some even dried them and used them as a natural sweetener for teas and baked goods. Apple peels weren't wasted either. They were simmered to make apple peel jelly or dried to create snacks. Beyond food, fruit peels had practical uses. Citrus peels were used as natural air fresheners, rubbed on surfaces for cleaning, or even tossed into fireplaces to give off a fresh scent. Today, with the push for zero-waste cooking, many of these old techniques are making a comeback. What was once a survival skill has now become an eco-friendly habit. 25. Depression-era soups. When resources were limited, soup became the ultimate survival food. It was cheap, filling, and could be stretched to feed an entire family with just a few ingredients. The best part? It didn't require a set recipe. People used whatever they had on hand, turning scraps into a warm, nourishing meal. A classic example was Hoover stew, a simple dish made with macaroni, canned tomatoes, hot dogs, and any available vegetables. Others made potato soup, using boiled potatoes, onions, and a little milk to create something creamy and comforting. Even just a handful of beans or lentils could turn water into a hearty meal. The secret to these soups was their flexibility. Leftover meat bones were boiled to create flavorful broths, while stale bread was often crumbled in to add bulk. These soups weren't fancy, but they kept people fed during hard times. The concept of using leftovers to create something delicious remains a valuable lesson in both thrift and creativity. 26. Homemade mock foods. When favorite foods were too expensive or unavailable, people got creative and made their own imitations, often called mock foods. These Depression-era inventions were designed to mimic pricier ingredients using whatever was on hand. One of the most famous examples was mock apple pie, made with Ritz crackers instead of apples. When boiled in a cinnamon sugar mixture, the crackers took on a texture surprisingly similar to baked apples. Another clever trick was mock whipped cream, made by whipping evaporated milk with sugar and a little vinegar to give it a fluffy texture. Meat was also faked when necessary. Some families made mock chicken using ground peanuts and breadcrumbs, or stretched small amounts of real meat with mashed potatoes and flour. These creations weren't just about saving money. They brought a sense of normalcy and comfort during difficult times. Surprisingly, some of these Depression-era tricks have stuck around. People's creativity in the kitchen can lead to something both practical and delicious. 27. Beans as a staple. When meat was too expensive, people turned to a cheaper, protein-packed alternative, beans. They weren't just a side dish, they became the star of the meal, stretched and transformed in countless ways to keep meals interesting and filling. One clever trick was using mashed beans as a meat substitute. Families mixed them with breadcrumbs and seasonings to create bean patties or meatballs that mimicked the texture of ground beef. Another popular trick was adding pureed beans to soups and sauces to make them thicker, heartier, and more nutritious without using flour or cream. But perhaps the most impressive was the way beans were used to make desserts. Black beans were mashed into brownie batter to add richness without extra fat, and white beans were sweetened to make simple cakes or cookies. These Depression-era tricks didn't just help families survive, they proved that with a little creativity, even the humblest ingredient could be turned into something satisfying. 28. Rice as a meal extender. When food needed to last longer, rice was the ultimate secret weapon. Cheap, versatile, and endlessly adaptable, it helped stretch meals by adding bulk to whatever was on hand. One of the smartest tricks was mixing rice with small amounts of meat or vegetables to create a meal that felt more filling. A single cup of rice, when cooked, could triple in size, making it perfect for bulking up soups, stews, or stir-fries. Even tiny scraps of chicken or beef could be turned into a satisfying dish when combined with a bowl of seasoned rice. But rice wasn't just a dinner staple. It was a budget-friendly breakfast and dessert, too. Families cooked it with milk and sugar to make a simple rice pudding or fried leftover rice with a little butter and cinnamon for a warm, comforting morning meal. This simple grain was a lifesaver. 29. Making homemade pasta. When store-bought pasta was too expensive or unavailable, people didn't give up on their favorite dishes. They simply made their own. With just 2 ingredients, flour and water, families could roll out fresh pasta at home, turning basic pantry staples into a hearty, filling meal. One clever trick was using a rolling pin or even a glass bottle to flatten the dough when a pasta machine wasn't an option. The dough was then cut into strips for noodles or shaped into dumplings for soups and stews. For a bit of extra protein, some households added an egg if they had one, but in desperate times, even that was skipped. Even without sauce, homemade pasta was far from boring. Families stretched whatever they had, garlic, herbs, or just a bit of butter, to create a satisfying dish. This trick not only saved money, but also gave people control over their food supply. Making things from scratch isn't just a necessity, it's an art. 30. Cooking with leftovers. Wasting food wasn't an option, so families had to get creative with leftovers. Instead of eating the same meal twice, they found ways to transform yesterday's scraps into something entirely new. A classic trick was turning leftover meat and vegetables into hash, a quick meal where everything was chopped up, fried together, and seasoned to taste. Another go-to was reviving stale rice by frying it with eggs and any available scraps to make a filling fried rice dish. Even leftover bread had new life, becoming stuffing, bread pudding, or crunchy croutons. Nothing was ever truly left over, it was just waiting for its next purpose. That mindset of reinventing food didn't just help people survive the Great Depression, it's still a valuable trick today for stretching meals and reducing waste. The Great Depression forced people to become resourceful, making every ingredient stretch as far as possible. But what's truly remarkable is how many of these survival tricks are still useful today. Whether it was stretching meat with fillers, making homemade pasta, or finding clever substitutes for expensive ingredients, these hacks weren't just about getting by, they were about making the most of what was available. In many ways, these Depression-era cooking tricks weren't just about survival, they were about creativity and adaptability. Even now, in a world where food waste is a major concern, overpopulation is making food scarce. For some societies and grocery prices keep rising, these old-school methods still have a place in the kitchen. From reusing leftovers to making broth from scraps, they remind us that food should never be taken for granted. So, the next time you find yourself throwing something away, remember, someone, somewhere, once turned that very thing into a meal. Maybe it's time we all start thinking a little more like the resourceful cooks of the past.